declared to be null and void, then where do we stand?
We go back to the 1920s, 30s, and 40s. And we have to also keep in mind that with a Supreme Court that is viewed now as predominantly conservative and Republican, we have to think in terms of what this means for the separation of powers, because, and also the checks and balances.
Right.
Because if it's a Republican court,
and it's a Republican Congress and a Republican president,
then you have no separation
That's
of powers,
right.
and you have no checks and balances. And I think that issue comes into focus as well.
Well, now, I think that one of the important things I think that we face even today, Dr. Baldwin, is the participation of African. The only way that we can keep things from changing is to be a part of the system.
And
as long as we keep ourselves out of the system without voting, see, that's what gets us into the system.
I think you're absolutely right, absolutely right. That midterm elections 2018 are very important because we have to be involved, we have to vote, we have to make sure that we are represented, not only at the congressional level, but in the future we have to be concerned about the executive branch. You know, where are we going in terms of the kind of president of the United States we want. Now the Supreme Court has pretty much been finalized for the time being and for perhaps generations to come. But we still have the right of the ballot. And we have to use that as our tool for effecting change.
That is the most important thing that we do have.
Exactly.
And disfranchisement, you know, about all of the issues surrounding disfranchisement and keeping black folks from the polls. That's all dealing with progress. People would like to remove Brown versus the Board of Education and all of these other Supreme Court decisions. Not everybody, but there are a large number of folks who would like to do so. And so we're going to take our break, and we'll be back with our audience following this very, very short commercial break. Thank you and welcome back to the final segment of the show for today. We're talking to Dr. Baldwin, and the topic is the African Americans and the United States Supreme Court. Dr. Baldwin, let's continue our discussion in reference to the African American and the court and some of the things that you believe to be important in terms of where we go from here.
Yes. I think one of the things, of course, we have to be concerned about is that we are moved completely from race, considerations based on race, to a system of merit-based admissions in colleges and universities, for an example, when you talk about affirmative action. Unfortunately, we don't have a Thurgood Marshall on the Supreme Court anymore. We don't have a Thurgood Marshall. We have Clarence Thomas, we have John Roberts, we have several other people on the Supreme Court who tend to lean toward the extreme right. And of course, we only have Alana Kagan and Sonia Sotomayor and Ruth Bader Ginsburg on the more liberal side, who tend to decide in favor of what? Decisions that benefit people of color and women. So what we have to be concerned about is what will happen to affirmative action. Now, in the past, the Supreme Court has deferred to corporations and universities, other institutions, to make their own decisions about how they plan to pursue diversity. I don't know if that will happen in the future. With the recent confirmation of Brett Kavanaugh to the Supreme Court, and as you well know, there was a lot of conflict, there was a lot of tension surrounding his nomination and confirmation to the Supreme Court. The fear we have now is that affirmative action will eventually be eliminated. And nothing worse could happen to African Americans, people of color, and even women.
That's right.
Because women have benefited from affirmative action, and that's often overlooked. The extent to which white women, black women, women in general have benefited from affirmative action. So the question is, where will the Supreme Court go from here? What impact can we have on the kind of decision making that comes out of the court? Now, we know that that it's a predominantly what? Republican court. Now, we have to call it what it is.
Been. That's right, it is now.
We have to call it what it is. The only question we have now is, how can we assure that the future of this nation is developed around this need to really include people.
Okay, very good.
To be inclusive, to make sure that all people enjoy the fullness of equality and their rights. Women, African Americans, Latinos, Asian Americans. I think that's very important as we look to the future in terms of what happens between not only African Americans in the Supreme Court, but minorities in general.
Well, everything since the Brown decision. Dealing with race is at stake in a real sense, and what we have to do, and the only way I see us getting around this situation, Dr. Baldwin, is through the suffrage. That's about the only way. I mean, I don't see any kind of laws that might be, or any kind of decisions that this court would be willing to issue that would bring back affirmative action, that would do something in terms of elevating the African American. I don't see that in this court. And
it's a court that is designed to turn back the clock. And as we look to the future, we need to press forward. As Dr. King and other civil rights leaders always said, that the goal is always to press forward and to design ways in which one can move the nation forward in terms of respect for diversity, in terms of inclusiveness, and we can't do that any other way than through the ballot.
That's the only way. I mean, that's the most important thing that we have going for us. It has always been, but quite recently there seems to be a tendency on the part of some of us to simply not vote and to simply give up voting.
That's unfortunate, but we are hoping that the 2018 midterms will be different. That people have gotten to the point where they realize that we're moving back instead of forward, and they will come out and vote. because the makeup of the Supreme Court is just as important as the makeup of the Senate and the House of Representatives and the executive branch. A lot of people don't pay attention to the Supreme Court. But those on the right did, and that's why Brett Kavanaugh was confirmed.
That's right.
Because they are expecting him to be a force in striking down affirmative action, in striking down the right of a woman to choose, in undermining the reproductive rights of women, in supporting those who are into gun advocacy, and those who are opposed to immigration, which brings in more people of color. So the right, I think, understands the extreme right, what's going on.
That's right.
But the important thing is that those of us who are not on the extreme right, those of us who support democratic policies, more liberal policies, more inclusive policies, have to get involved through the ballot.
And there's no other way. There's no other way that, as a matter of fact, I think it's constructed, and that's why the vote is important. And what we have to do is to make every person, not only Africans, because black, white, or whatever, make every person understand how important the suffrage is. That's the most important thing in a democracy.
That's right.
That's what a democracy is all about, isn't it?
That's right. You lose democracy if you don't vote. Your voice is not represented. You know, the gains that we've made as a result of the civil rights movement, Martin Luther King Jr.'s sacrifices, the sacrifices of other people, grassroots people, all of that is lost if we don't go vote. And that's the important thing.
And so that's why the Supreme Court is important. But now, see, it seems now that the Supreme Court just might be out of our reach in terms of having any kind of influence, because what do? I mean, how can you influence the court as long as the court is constituted as the court is constituted?
Well, we'll hope for that providential design has something to do with it.
There's a lot of old folks.
You can always put people like Brett Kavanaugh and others on the court, but ultimately we, as coming out of the black church tradition and all, we know that that there's a power above.
That's right, above the Supreme Court.
That ultimately decides what's going to happen in the future.
That's right.
And hopefully our reliance on that is what will save us. I mean, the people on the extreme right can put everyone they desire in positions of power.
That's right.
But ultimately, we have to understand that this universe is not controlled
by the people on the right.
By the people on the right or by the powers that be on this earth.
That's right. That's exactly.
But ultimately, there's a higher power in charge, and I think, in a sense, that's the only thing that we have to rely on.
That's
because those who have put Brett Kavanaugh and others in place, Neil Gorsuch on the Supreme Court, they are assuming that for generations they will control the court.
That's what they're saying. That's exactly what they're saying. That is, you know, for the next 40 years, nothing will change in reference to the court.
But what is in the plan and the promise of the higher power?
That's right. That's right.
And that's what is.
As an older person, I can also say that we've got a lot of old folks on the Supreme Court. And so what we have to do is to vote in such a way so that we can influence the individuals that will be appointed to the court from now on.
Elect a new president
right.
On the Democratic side, hopefully.
That's right.
On the side that considers more the issues confronting minority people and women.
That's right.
Doesn't have to be a Democrat, but we need someone who's sensitive to the issues of justice and inclusiveness.
That's right.
And equality of opportunity. All of that is important.
That's right. And I think that if we can keep our minds on that, you see, starting with this election,
in 2018,
you know,
the midterm,
because I think you can send a signal. Dr. Baldwin, we're going to have to end it for today, and let me encourage our audience to tune in again next week for another informative edition of Comments. Thank you and good morning.